The opening of episode 2 strongly resembles the first, in that it's Armin once again narrating the history of the Titans and the Walls. Also similar to the first, it achieves quite a few things very efficiently. Number 1, it continues building up Armin as the brains of the group. Considering that Eren is sort of the leader among them and is the character we primarily follow in the series, Armin being the one to deliver the narration does sort of go against what you'd normally expect. And that is made further pronounced because what we hear here is not some philosophical debate as we saw in the first episode. Rather, it is a very basic and fundamental belief of how the walls came to be, something that Eren surely knows very well. So again, the protagonist not delivering that narration is a deviation from the norm, but I'd argue that this is done intentionally because unlike Eren, Armin remains impartial. He delivers the information with no emotion. He just recites something that, to best of his knowledge, is fact. And if you apply that to everything that would come after, you can probably see why Armin's neutrality in the situation is important, as Eren would become an even worse version of those same monsters that humanity was trying to escape. Number 2, it furthers the mystery of the Titans, because those 20 seconds bring up a wide variety of questions. Things like what exactly happened 100 years ago that made the Titans appear, how the walls were even built considering their size, what is the reasoning for their names, and why is it that something is suddenly changed now, just to name a few. It of course never asks those questions outright, but with a really basic bit of exposition, it reignites that curiosity that had been set up in the previous episode. And number 3, it both builds suspense for what we're about to see, and solidifies the magnitude of the situation. By cutting off Armin's narration at, however, you are immediately shown that this is a first, and no one knows what happens next. Everything that follows is uncharted territory, and the story is trying to put you into that situation by blatantly cutting off a sentence before he can even elaborate. And very fittingly, the shots following the OP are almost a direct follow-up to what Armin was saying, as we see the aftermath of this tragedy. And of course, we also see the obligatory close-up on a crow, which, in fiction, is very much known as the universal signifier of death and evil. Though the interesting thing here is that this, albeit obviously tragic, but peaceful moment is not lingered on. Instead, as the crow calls, again signifying death, we cut to this religious man frantically spouting words from his book. And this man's blind faith calls back to what Armin mentioned at the end of the previous episode. Choosing to essentially hide the truth of the horrors outside of the walls is nothing but ignorance, the consequences of which can be seen as this man continues walking into the swarm of titans as if the chance did anything. All it is that same veil of ignorance Armin was talking about. And notice the background details in this scene. Throughout the entire thing, you hear screams in the background, but they're not loud, rather, they're very subtle, which combined with the slow and somber music paints a hopeless picture rather than one of chaos. Clearly there's still a lot of panic, but by choosing to focus on the Titans and a select few people who are picked off instead of the crowds running for their lives, the show more so conveys the unpreparedness of humanity and the sheer hopelessness of the situation. The intention is to establish the Titans as a force that destroys everything in their path in a cold and almost matter-of-fact-like fashion, which in my opinion, it achieves extremely well. And considering where the series is headed long-term, I think focusing on the anguish of a select few rather than the crowds and the chaos also creates this very personal experience of what an event such as this would feel like from a regular person's perspective. In the long run, of course, the whole tragedy is that Eren would repeat the cycle himself, creating a far, far larger tragedy for millions of people, and quite literally making existence hopeless, as the March of the Wall Titans is infinitely worse than what we see here. And speaking of Eren, it's then that we follow up with Hans trying to get him and Mikasa to safety. And here, we get an absolutely incredible scene that is so much more important in retrospect. Hans says that Eren wasn't able to save his mother because he lacked the power to do so, but that he couldn't because he lacked the courage to fight. In retrospect, we of course know that following this point, power is essentially the only thing Eren would pursue. So in many ways, this almost feels like a line that solidifies his path. Because in his mind, if he gets that power which Hans is talking about, nothing like this can ever happen again. It also makes Eren realize that relying on others is a liability. As in Hans' case, he should have been able to take that Titan down. It was merely his lack of courage that prevented him from doing that. Moving further into the series, especially closer to the final arcs, that's exactly what we'd see, as Eren would begin to push away everyone because, in his mind, he is the only one with a strong enough dedication and with the power to see his plans through. And it's also here that yet another one of Attack on Titan's mysteries are set up: Mikasa's headaches. In the final season, as told by Eren, apparently it's because of the Ackerman's genes and that their bloodline was basically created as tools to protect their hosts. Though importantly, none of this has ever been confirmed as fact, and considering Eren's intentions in the final season, it's very difficult to say how much or if any of it was true. Especially considering that Levi, for example, doesn't quite exhibit the same things as Mikasa. His power is obviously still off the charts, that much is true, but as far as we can see, it's not directly tied to any single person. You might argue that Irvin might have been that, but even in that case, it's nowhere near the level of Mikasa and Eren. So then the question arises of, what is the true cause? As far as I'm concerned, there is absolutely at least some link between Mikasa and Eren. To what extent and what it is caused by, that is hard to say, but just look at some of these examples. In the cabin flashback, Mikasa literally has that signature Titan lightning circling around her body as Eren says his signature "fight, fight." In the episode following Eren's supposed death, we have this shot of what looks like blood cells. After which, Mikasa jumps back on her feet and continues fighting, despite saying herself that she thought she had given up. On initial viewing, that of course seemed like a moment just for the sake of dramatization, as Mikasa essentially just finds herself in this scene. But knowing what we know now, I am not so certain. But regardless, with the Titan lightning, the shot of something in her genes being activated and changing, and her suddenly jumping back on her feet despite saying herself that it is over, it lends credence to the fact that, in some way, there is a direct link between her and either the Founding Titan or Eren specifically. Though we will leave that discussion for further down the line, as there will be quite a few more instances that raise this issue. So for now, just know that in this situation where Eren just heard that he lacks strength, Mikasa suddenly got a headache. It's only following all of that deeply personal tragedy that we finally zoom out to see how the wider masses are reacting to the walls being breached. And it's here that we once again get some exposition from Armin, notably explaining the rationale for having protruding districts such as Shiganshina. This essentially lays down the motivation for retaking Shiganshina later in the series, since it is both a vital military position, and it is the only way to travel in and out of this side of Wall Maria, so it only makes sense that it would be of significant importance. These sorts of strategic decisions we hear about in the series is another thing I've always found really interesting. Even with the seemingly indestructible walls, we still hear that extra precautions were taken to manage the Titans by luring them to a single manageable point. It's one of those details that easily could not have been there and no one would likely notice, but it's one that just makes the world and setting feel that much more real, because from a strategic point of view, it makes perfect sense. From a narrative perspective, it of course is also very useful since it is, by its very nature, the most dangerous point of the walls. So the whole premise of Titans immediately swarming in also seems a lot more plausible since that is the whole point of having these protrusions. And also, considering that we now know the walls have titans in them, obviously they couldn't have really smashed holes in the walls themselves just yet, so the gates also solve that issue. As Eren and Mikasa finally make it to the boat though, we get to see the larger picture and the sheer number of titans in the walls. And it's also here where yet another track of the Attack on Titan's stellar soundtrack kicks in. And while I could gush about the music of the series for hours on end, for now, I just want to talk about how many different kinds of music are mixed in here. Almost as if the chaos we're seeing on screen had been turned into music itself. It's that signature choir we'd get throughout the series. There's that heavy, pulsing bass. There are classic strings, but underneath all of that, you have this uneasy, scratchy beat. And paired with the chaos intensifying as we see that the military is clearly not prepared to handle something like this, the soundtrack fits in simply brilliantly. And just when things couldn't get any worse, we hear some unnaturally loud stomps in the distance. And for that brief moment, absolutely all music cuts out. And the only thing we hear are those loud stomps getting closer and closer. And for us as the viewer, that pulsing background music I just talked about suddenly becomes very, very real. Almost as if it manifests into the show itself, as now, it's no longer music. It's another yet unknown threat stomping in the distance. It's these minuscule details that, in my opinion, add up to absolutely nail the experience and feel of the series. Let's be honest, how many people will notice that the music itself fades into the real happenings on screen? Probably very, very few. But on a subconscious level, that anticipation that had been building through the music has an immediate payoff. And one more thing that I feel like I just have to bring up is this shot, which is literally 3 seconds long, but is absolutely brilliant. As that silence still lingers and we hear the stomps in the distance, we get this dolly zoom type shot as we see this lone soldier among the destruction. In case you've never heard of the dolly zoom or vertigo effect, it's essentially just a camera trick that creates this really unique shift in perspective. There are countless examples of it in cinema, and you've no doubt seen it before. But the thing is, like I just said, it's a camera trick. When you're working in animation, you do not have a camera which you can just move back and forth in the traditional sense. Of course, by using computer-generated backgrounds and carefully tracking those to achieve that effect, it's not quite as crazy as drawing every single frame by hand. But regardless, that's still a very respectable amount of work for what is literally a 3-second scene. But as we cut over to the armored titan, he stomps down his foot right up against the camera, putting us as close as possible and emphasizing the sheer destructive power of his steps alone. And once again, the music sharply cuts in. And that is amplified as we see him begin his charge, which quite literally tears apart the very ground he's running on. And the only question we hear from the military is a confused and helpless, "What is that?" And notice how we see the cannons being fired at him, but him not even flinching. Yet only a second later, it takes a titan right off its feet, further emphasizing the power of this new enemy. And suddenly, the whole gate-closing conflict we just saw means absolutely nothing, as we cut to the first-person view of the Armored as he goes clean through the gates, leaving a massive hole in his wake. And of course, as with most of these early episodes, watching these back and noticing all the things that flew over our heads initially is a large part of what makes the series so great. Because just like I talked about in the first episode, this seemingly random occurrence of not one, but two inexplainable titans appearing at once and making coordinated attacks to breach the walls is not random at all. This is just Reiner, and that initial mystery is rather replaced by the tension of what is actually a full-on attack from Marley. And of course, watching this back, knowing what was going through his mind during all of this, also changes your perspective quite a bit. Because remember that at this point, he is 12 years old. All this are a couple of indoctrinated kids carrying out orders that they really have no understanding of. What they're doing is terrible, yes, but similar to Eren, they too were essentially created by their own environments. As we cut to Eren though, while thinking back to what Hans said earlier, he explicitly says that humans are weak, and then follows up with, "I'll exterminate them, not sparing a single one." Now, obviously we all know what this is foreshadowing here, because we all know that it wouldn't be human Eren who'd attempt to wipe out literally the entire world. But that's not the interesting part here. Rather, I want you to pay attention to his eyes. Notice how when he's sitting there and brooding over what happens, his eyes are quite desaturated. But it's when he gets enraged and promises to exterminate everyone with no exceptions, that's when his eyes suddenly become that signature and very detailed emerald green. So the simple question to ask is, who is the one speaking right now? Or rather, from which point in time is he speaking right now? In case you missed the first video, I talk about it a whole bunch there. But while Eren does not have the Attack Titan now, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that it doesn't quite work like that, and that he can still receive memories despite not actually having the power at this point in time. And with that said, this could easily be him receiving visions which push him further into that rage-fueled dedication to wipe out everything. Shortly after, we get a massively important scene that, on initial viewing, was absolutely baffling. While in retrospect, it's probably the most important scene in, well, the entire story, I guess. We see what Eren believes to be a nightmare where his father is trying to inject him with something and screaming about finding his way to the basement. And while yes, even on initial viewing we clearly knew that this was not a nightmare as he does have the key upon waking up, the rest of the vision is basically a mystery. But the fact that we are literally shown Eren getting the founding and the Attack Titan in literally the second episode is still crazy to me. Clearly there's no way to know what basically any of that means currently, but still, that is very brave considering how much it actually shows. But yes, as of now, Eren already has both the Attack Titan as well as the founding, and his 13-year countdown begins. Though even aside from the whole Titan thing, which we're totally clueless about in the story right now, the mystery of the basement is teased absolutely beautifully here. The whole chaotic scene with this inexplicable syringe and his father seemingly going mad screaming about it just leaves you with that one fundamental question of why? Why must Eren see what's there? What makes it so special? Why did he keep it secret in the first place if it was so important? It just brings up countless questions that will keep you on the edge of your seat for the rest of the season as the mystery slowly starts coming together. And with that said, it's also worth noting how risky something like this is in the first place. The premise of a mysterious location with something incredibly important hidden there is literally the most basic of storytelling concepts. But the thing is, you have to deliver on it, especially if it is teased as much as it is in Attack on Titan. The longer you drag such a mystery out, the more the viewers or readers essentially build headcanon around it that will be incredibly difficult to match. How many times have you seen stories, games, or anything else for that matter, fail simply because expectations were set at a literally impossible to reach level? And that's what Isayama was risking here. Though without getting ahead of myself too much, I think it's safe to say that ultimately the basement reveal very much delivered. And yes, for my fellow One Piece folks, imagine what Oda is thinking about right now, because that mystery is much longer. Though yeah, returning to Attack on Titan, we'll be talking more about the basement reveal once we actually get to it. Shortly after Eren awakens though, he already finds himself getting into some trouble. We pretty much see these two guys from the military talk about how they shouldn't be sharing food with the outsiders, and laughing about how the Titans should have snacked on more people. For obvious reasons, this hits a nerve for Eren, and he goes to give them a piece of his mind. Though I think this scene achieves a few things that you might not notice straight away. Number one, it's obviously just another example of Eren's very matter-of-fact nature. He doesn't care if he's going up against someone 3 times his size, he will say and do whatever he wants. Though number two, the military here, in my mind at least, works to convey the opinion of the wider public, in that no one really considers the Titans as a real threat. Sure, they hear about the walls being breached and whatnot, but to them, the idea of that happening here is inconceivable, just like it was for the people in Shiganshina. The walls have stood for what they believe to be 100 years. How would 2 of them be suddenly breached now, right? But to Eren, this seems both naive and, for lack of a better word, stupid. They just breached the walls as if it was nothing. Clearly they must do something so that it doesn't happen again. And considering he literally just lost his mother, this ignorance angers him because it's exactly what got her killed. Remember that if Hans was properly trained, maybe his mother would have made it. And so here, Eren basically sees the same thing happening again. And clearly, he wants to avoid that. And again, notice Armin being the one who brokers peace here after Eren makes a mess. Though following the exchange, Eren has still not calmed down and we see a similar conflict brewing between him and Armin. Here too, he says that he will slaughter every Titan in his way, which, either intentionally or not, obviously reads very different in retrospect, as it's something pretty extreme for a kid to say. Though when Armin tries to de-escalate the situation, Eren only gets more angry, saying that their life is pitiful. And despite Armin trying to talk some sense into him, it's of little use. And notice how it's specifically Armin saying that they have no choice that ultimately sends Eren into a frenzy, as we once again linger on his super detailed green eye. As to how much you want to read into this eye stuff is up to you, but with how much focus is put on it later into the story, I very much think that the idea here is to convey the future Eren already playing a role in these scenes. Especially because it is the line about freedom that enrages him, and we know that total freedom is the one and only thing that Eren wishes to pursue. Though what may just be the most important thing in this entire exchange is what follows next. Because as Eren continues his tirade on Armin, Mikasa punches him to stop him. If you've seen the first video, you already know exactly what I'm getting at. Because remember that Mikasa's one and only goal is to protect Eren, so your immediate reaction here might be, hey wait, how come she punched him? But what you have to realize is that she protects him, even if it is from himself, which in this case, it very much is. She stopped him before he could say something to Armin that he couldn't take back anymore. She knows how important Armin is to Eren, and considering that he has already lost his mother and supposedly father because they obviously don't know Eren actually ate him, from Mikasa's perspective, it's easier to just punch Eren and force him to cool down. But again, she still protects him. I already talked about what I think this means for the end of the series in the first video, so feel free to check it out in case you missed it. But again, this entire exchange is very purposeful, and each and every one of them fulfills their usual roles to a T. Following this, we get a little bit more of Armin's narration explaining what happened in the following years. And similar to what I already talked about before, this is one of those things that's purely designed to give you a sense of scale, as it purposely gives you explicit numbers to paint a picture of how dire the situation is. We hear that there was a plan to recapture Wall Maria, for which about a fifth of the population was recruited, amounting to 250,000 people. From those 250,000, only 100 ever returned. And the thing is, you hear this, and sure it sounds bad, but humans don't really comprehend what a number like 250,000 looks like. So let me repeat that and visualize what this means. As Armin just said, the recruits were a fifth of the population, so some basic math leads you to the total population of around 1.25 million people. Of those, 250,000 were recruited as soldiers, and only 100 of those 250,000 survived. The sheer scale of this mission and its losses are absolutely staggering. Remember that to these people, the walls are all there is, so just imagine a fifth of the population being wiped out in the space of a single year. To give you another point of reference, the entire population of Europe and the United States combined is still not a fifth of the world, so just imagine both of them disappearing in a single year. It's one of those small things that most people will overlook, but it goes a long way toward making the world feel that much more real, as well as establishing just how ruthless it is. Considering everything in the story following this point would be about Eren's trio venturing beyond the walls, the fact that a fifth of the entire population was wiped out in a year just becomes a very daunting reminder. And once again, the slow and somber music playing as these absolutely brutal facts are laid out paint the scene so well. I know I've used the word a million times already, but that's because there really is no other way to describe it. Everything we're seeing here is utter hopelessness. Every single event so far has shown us that unless something changes, humanity has absolutely no chance against the Titans as is, let alone when something like the Colossal or Armored appears and breaks through the walls which were thought to be impenetrable. And I think the scene we fade into captures that beautifully. We see Armin cry as he's holding his grandfather's hat, and remembering that he's already lost both of his parents, he essentially has no family left. And because of that, when Eren says that he'll be joining the Corp, Armin says, "Me too." And following his claim, Mikasa says that she'll be joining as well. These three kids have quite literally lost everything. And while Eren might be pulling the strings behind the scenes, even taking the scene on the face of it, they have nothing to lose anymore. Clearly they know that life inside the walls is not safe, so what else is there but to fight? And if that isn't brutal, then I really don't know what is. And with that somber tune fades out as we fade years ahead and see the trio among the new trainees. And importantly, while Commander Heath gives his speech, you have that suspenseful yet hopeful music building in the background. But as we cut to Eren, it becomes dark and twisted as he states his intentions. He will exterminate every last one of them. On a surface level, of course the much more intense music just accentuates Eren's strong desire, but in retrospect, that is once again completely changed, as we now know that the goal of exterminating the Titans changed, or perhaps always was, to rather exterminate everything outside of the walls. And so that dark switch in the music almost seems like a character-centric track where, just like we'd see in the series, Eren's goal is twisted into something much darker, exactly as we hear in the music. Though in a broader sense, this immediate time skip after just 2 episodes also establishes an important part of the series. Much of what we're seeing here is much bigger than just a single story. Initially, you're led to believe that the show will primarily be a character-driven drama, since we follow Eren so closely. But this time skip tells you that, no, that was merely the prologue. And while Eren is obviously an important part of the story, he is just that, a part of it. This type of extended prologue is often used for historical epics where you want to follow a single character, but it's ultimately the wider world that would tell the rest of the story. For example, super minor spoilers for Season 1 of Vinland Saga, but there too we follow the young Thorfinn for a few episodes. only to skip forward once we've seen his character shaped through tragedy. And again, while he is important to the narrative, he's merely one part of it. But with that, that is the end of episode 2. And now that we're finally through the prologue, the story itself can properly start chugging along. And while that does mean the following episodes won't have quite as many insane foreshadowing moments setting up the grander picture, there is still plenty to talk about. Everything from Mikasa's enhanced abilities to more future Eren shenanigans and everything in between. And that is where we will pick up next time. And that's the video. Just wanted to quickly say a big thank you for the reception of the first video in the series, because I seriously never expected it to do so well right off the bat. And speaking of thank yous, as always, I want to say a massive thank you to our patrons who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest member of the team, Too Much Matcha. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you, thank you. And if you wish to join the highly coveted Mystery Shack Insiders Club, you can do so for as little as $1 per month. Though with that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye!